So this is a big one. It's got many tentacles. We had a men's retreat, Henry and I and 2 other guys. It included psilocybin and MDMA at one point. It was a beautiful experience. I learned a lot about myself. I will share that with you in the hopes that it helps you as well. There were a lot of interesting things, and one of them was that in the opening talking circle, one of the things that the facilitator, who was a woman, brought up was patriarchy. And you knew it as soon as that word was said.
Flashes in
Flashes,
red.
a flashback.
It was such a nice, like, calm experience. We were settling into the room. There was sage. We were sitting Indian style, and she opened, I'd like to start with a little reading. This one is about the patriarchy. And I looked over at Charlie, and I knew it was on, so go ahead.
So there's a lot of caveats that I want to give. And the first is that I realized immediately, because as she said the word, I was like, oh, God. And then she said what it meant to her in that context. I was like, I completely subscribe to that. So I think the way that you define the word, I could be completely in agreement with you or totally in disagreement. And it's one of those words that is kind of a weasel word, and people use it to serve all different kinds of agendas. So that's one of the things that I first realized. But she said, you know, in terms of this, one of the things that you guys can begin to think about is how the gender expectations on men, like men don't cry, or if they're too sensitive, it's gay, and if you're gay, that's undesirable. And if, you know, all of the things that American mainstream society puts on both girls, but in this case, it was a men's retreat, young boys, how that has impacted you. And I thought that was a fantastic prompt. I totally believe that there are gendered expectations that limit people's ability to authentically express themselves, and so I settled down.
I settled into it as well. I was there was one thing after yeah, I'm gonna let you break it down, but there was one part she left out.
Well, go ahead. I don't know what you were.
I've looked up the definition of patriarchy, and it says it's a system of or societal or government in which men hold all the power and women are largely excluded from it.
Yes.
And her definition was much more nuanced. It's like a domineering system of men dominating other men. I was like, I know that in my life, like bullying other men. And then I just was waiting for that one little like, and you're not allowed to be here too, right?
Yeah. So this is one of the things is, one of the first questions is, in your definition of the patriarchy, is the review of history and of current society and of current American society that implies a sort of a battle of the sexes.
Yes.
That it is a cohort of men looking out for men, doing things that benefit men who have the financial and political power, primarily, or at least if you chosen this word, it's a really important way, operating against the interests of women. Or is it a small group of people that happen to be men operating against the interests of anyone else? And that distinction seems very important, because I wouldn't dispute that a small group of people have had power at every stage of human history, and they haven't always acted within the interests of society at large. What I would say, though, is that it's not primarily been categorized as men versus women. It's been tribe versus tribe. It's been, I think Jordan Peterson points out, primarily the domination is nature oppressing men with storms and scarcity and plague and famine. And so to say that we live in a system, or to believe that we live in a system that is primarily or foundationally characterized as men versus women, I don't think is true, even if you can point to legislation that might privilege men over women. I think a prime example of this that I was just seeing as we talked about is, like, take a look at Afghanistan. They just barred women from being able to go to college. That is certainly a piece of cultural or legislative thing that privileges being a man over being a woman, and strips power from all women collectively in that society. So that is something that is... yeah, I think a prime example of
patriarchy.
Yes. The problem that I had, and we had a different discussion, is implied for a lot of people in patriarchy is that the way to solve this is by elevating women to positions of power. And I think that misses that this isn't, like what happened in Afghanistan, for instance, is not primarily men versus women. It's religious fundamentalism dominating everything. And so this is one tendril where there are certain roles that men are expected to play and women are expected to play an inferior role. But that is actually secondary to this overwhelming belief that we're going to read this book. We're going to do it like things were done in the Stone Age. We're going to stone gaze and kill infidels and do all kinds of other crazy things. And the way that you combat that is not by elevating women to positions of power, because if you elevate female religious fundamentalists to positions of power in the Taliban, not much changes. What you need to do is find the actual root of it, which you could argue is religious fundamentalism. You could argue is lack of education. You could argue about it, but I do not believe that the root of it is men versus women. I believe that that is merely an outcropping of this other mind ideological issue. And so when you call it a patriarchy, I think you can, while you might be correct in some of the visible things that it expresses, you are not identifying the piece that needs to change in order for things to get better across the board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
After our first day, which was beautiful, and we all learned about each other, and it was heartfelt and amazing, and got to explore the ways in which, in some cases, our imposed gender roles limited our authentic expression of ourselves. We were then hanging out, chatting afterwards, and I said,
it was a decompressing moment. I had slipped into the hot tub. Long day of sky time, ready to just turn my brain off. And Charlie said, "So, what did you mean by the patriarchy?" And everyone was just like, "We're gonna do this now."
But go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what we were sorting through was that underlining principles. You were figuring out what they meant, so you could then tell them what your idea is. Mm-hmm. And I found that really fascinating, is this move towards subjective experience then tied to a larger societal idea.
Yeah, I can break that down if you want. So I said, what is the patriarchy? And it was, well, it's a system of male domination, and it's often associated with whiteness. And, it was like a whole, in my opinion, and I love this facilitator. She's helped me so tremendously in my life. And this is not at all a dig on her. This is me disagreeing with the idea. There was a whole panoply of like woke buzzwords that were kind of in there that, 3 more alarms went off in my head.
Patriarchy,
problematic, whiteness. I don't think it was said, but heteronormativity was probably colorism. All of these things just started to like, okay. And so I was ready to go. And as we talked, what you pointed out that was interesting is I said, I feel like these things, that's not how I view it, blah, blah, blah. And she said, well, let me give you an example of my life. When I was younger, I said that I wanted to be a doctor. And a man nearby said, don't you mean nurse? And in that moment, she said that she felt her heart sink. It was like the bottom dropped out. And I imagined that it was, oh my gosh, my dreams are not achievable because of who I am. And that is absolutely not anything that I want to happen. I don't think that we should do that to little girls. I don't think we should do that to little boys who say they want to be nurses. I don't think, I think the fewer, I think we really need to explore the limitations that we place on children and make sure that the limitations that we place on them are actually in their best interest and not in the interest of serving a worldview that makes us feel safe. So yeah, probably don't let them cross the street without looking both ways. But if they want to be a nurse or a doctor, we can explore why we think that wasn't a good idea, and I don't agree with that. But what was interesting is as she was talking, it started to become clear, and I didn't really get it until after the hot tub, is that I think whatever ideology or whatever ism or whatever issue you have with the world or whatever, if you really love capitalism or communism or Democrats or Republicans, or you've got an issue with the patriarchy or you've got an issue with the gynocracy and your super red pill, I find increasingly that this says much more about the person than it does about the world. And I think that, and I know that I've done this because when I look back at the things that I've been extremely fired up by in my life, and the way that I understood the world to be, it was almost always me universalizing my experience so as not to really point to the real issues in my life that harm me and get to say, this is the government is doing this, or the Democrats or the Republicans or whatever. So in my life, I mentioned this to you, it looked like when I was in college, you could predict my political stance by just asking who the underdog was. So in any sort of like America versus Latin America, I was always with Latin America. Israel versus Palestine is with Palestine without knowing anything. And by the way, I don't know anything about it. Any sort of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, I just had to look at who the weaker one was, and I associated with them. And I think that's because I self-identified as an underdog and expected people with power to take advantage of people without, which definitely is a principle the world works by, but it is not a guarantee. It is not always true that the person with less power is the person who is in the right, nor is it true that the nation with less power is, the nation that ought to receive my moral support. I mean, the broad thing I think I said, which is I don't think it's the most useful lens through which to describe society, even though you can point to parts where it's like, oh, this is like an example of a patriarchal law that is privileges men over women, and we would want to disrupt that. I don't think that frame gets you to the best solutions. I think a better frame is the broader one that I described with materialism, which is my the other thing. Also, nice. I think it does have a lopsided. It implies to many that it's men versus women, and what you see is men versus men, and really it's just like close groups of kin taking care of their own. Those include men and women against others, and really, foundationally, there's a harsh, unforgiving world that is not offering easily food and clean water and abundance to all. And that we've had to carve out our own place, and that we've collectively actually made quite comfortable, at least for some, though there are many that don't even have clean water still.